Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. Over the past couple days, a massive topic of discussion in the MMA community has been Francis Ngannou's contract situation and how him deciding not to re-sign with the UFC may have been the biggest mistake of his career. We are going to take a deep dive on the Francis Ngannou situation from start to finish. We are going to talk about previous UFC contract negotiations. We're going to talk about offers from BKFC. We're going to talk about the supposed $20 million offer from One Championship. We're going to talk about potential boxing options for Francis Ngannou. We're going to take a look at a tweet from Francis Ngannou's coach, which nobody's basically talking about at this point. And I'm going to give my opinion on where I think Francis Ngannou ends up next. And did he make a mistake? Now, before I get into anything, I want to say, spoiler alert, at this point in time, it is impossible to know with 100% certainty whether or not Francis Ngannou made a mistake. And I'm going to speculate about it towards the later end of this video, but right now, we just don't have enough information. It is an incomplete story. But what I keep seeing time and time again from the MMA community, in comments, in live streams, on Twitter, on Instagram, I keep hearing a common metaphor. Francis Ngannou fumbled the bag. And I am so tired of hearing this because it is impossible to know at this point if it was a mistake or not. And if anybody's just constantly saying this over and over and over again, they're really saying it with such limited information. There is no way at this point in time they know that to be accurate. And honestly, just using that expression in general, in my opinion, you lose all credibility. I'm tired of hearing people say that. People on Twitter are saying that, oh, Francis Ngannou fumbled the bag. I've seen it so many times in my live streams, people saying that to me. I'm tired of hearing it. It's not accurate as of right now. And people just saying it over and over again doesn't make it true. There's a large sector of fans that are actively rooting against Francis Ngannou. And we're going to talk about that later in the video as well. So what happened with Francis Ngannou? Francis Ngannou has been in the UFC for a while. He won the UFC Heavyweight title against Stipe Miocic back in March of 2021. Now, Francis Ngannou had issues with the UFC in the past before this, but he won the title in March of 2021, and then it seemed like issues started to stem from there. What happened is Francis Ngannou was on the tail end of his UFC contract. The UFC, especially when you're higher up in the rankings, a champion, a massive star, the UFC does not like to let you fight out your contract. So you get down to 2 fights, you get down to 1 fight on your contract, they try to renegotiate with you. Francis Ngannou told the UFC, I want to fight out my contract and see what else is out there for me. The UFC hates that. Case in point, Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz wanted to do the same thing. He's a star within the UFC. What did the UFC try to do? It ultimately failed. They tried to book Nate Diaz versus Khamzat Chimaev because Dana White and the UFC are petty. They wanted to see Nate Diaz get absolutely slaughtered on his way out of the UFC. Khamzat missed weight. That's a topic for a whole nother video. But the UFC hates when prominent fighters attempt to fight out their contract. Now, Francis Ngannou, by attempting to fight out his contract, kind of shot himself in the foot in terms of money. Because what happens is you sign these contracts, then you start winning, you potentially get to a title fight, you win a title. The UFC likes to renegotiate because not only do they want to lock you down for longer because you become more prominent in their organization, you're also basically deserve more money because now you're headlining a pay-per-view. But Francis Ngannou didn't want to do that. So essentially for his last few fights, he was fighting for a very cheap amount of money. He wasn't fighting for a whole lot of money. He wasn't fighting for millions. He was being massively underpaid, but essentially by his own decision because he said, you know what, I want to fight out my contract. I'll fight for this amount, and then I want to see where we go from there. We can try to renegotiate from there. He was essentially betting on himself. And then after he beat Stipe Miocic and became champion, and he had these negotiations with the UFC wasn't happy about it. Francis Ngannou told the UFC, I can fight in September. He won the belt in late March. He said, I can fight in September. The UFC said, no, we want you to fight in August. Francis Ngannou said, no, I need till September. I need to get ready. I need to have a training camp. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. I need till September. 1 month later, what did the UFC do? They did Cyril Gane versus Derek Lewis for an interim championship. And basically, they delayed Francis Ngannou for fighting for another basically half a year. And then when Francis Ngannou finally did step back into the cage, it was against Ciryl Gane. We had Francis Ngannou versus Ciryl Gane. This was back at UFC 270, January of 2022. And this was the last fight on Francis Ngannou's contract. Once he fought this fight, he's essentially out of his UFC contract, or that's at least what most people think. Francis Ngannou fights Ciryl Gane. He defeats Ciryl Gane, wins by decision, hangs on to the UFC Heavyweight Championship. He's not out of his contract, because if you fight out your contract, but your last fight is for a title and you win that fight, you are automatically extended by 1 year or 3 fights. Well, Francis Ngannou had a knee injury. He had to have knee surgery. So basically, he decided, I'm going to sit out for that full year, and the UFC is going to have to let me go, essentially, or have to try to work with me to sign a new contract. Well, that year comes and goes. The UFC's trying to negotiate with him. All the fans, everybody wants Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones. That is the fight that people want. We find out in January, Francis Ngannou is being let go by the UFC's organization. Francis Ngannou, well, not really the UFC's letting him go. Francis Ngannou decides to leave, decides not to re-sign, and the UFC waives the rights to have an exclusive negotiating period and have the right to match an offer. And what that means is, even once you wait out that full year, the UFC still has, and I don't remember the exact term, I think it's either 3 or 6 months, and then I think a year. The UFC has the rights to have an exclusive negotiating period, which means you can't talk to any other promoters until this period ends. Sometimes it's 3 months, sometimes it's 6 months. It depends on the contract. But the UFC waived that, and then after that period, when the fighter then can go negotiate with other promotions, they have an exclusive right to match period of like a year, where that means if Ngannou goes out and signs with Bellator, he has to bring that contract back to the UFC, and the UFC can decide to match it. Well, in January, when the UFC announced Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane, they announced, look, we're cutting ties with Ngannou. We're not going to keep the rights to match. We're not going to keep the exclusive negotiating period. And the reason they did that is they were so fed up with Ngannou and the fact that they couldn't re-sign him that they wanted to negate any leverage he would have out on the open market by saying, look, the UFC has the rights to match here. That's essentially what they were doing. I'm not saying that the UFC would have matched. I'm just saying that's why the UFC decided to basically waive those periods of time to be able to potentially keep Francis Ngannou after his contract did expire for him waiting out the year. So now, after that, everyone's wondering, what's going to happen with Francis Ngannou? He's not re-signing with the UFC. What's he going to do? He's talked about boxing in the past. We have BKFC, we have Bellator, we have One Championship, we have PFL. What's going to happen with him? Well, we saw that apparently BKFC was in discussions with Francis Ngannou. And then recently, like a couple weeks ago, BKFC came out and said Francis Ngannou was asking for way too much money. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about BKFC, but BKFC cannot afford Francis Ngannou. That was never a legitimate landing spot for Francis Ngannou. BKFC probably can't afford me. I'd be shocked. I know Eddie Alvarez is high on BKFC. I'd be shocked if BKFC is still around in 5 years. They could never afford Francis Ngannou. They were never going to be able to sign Francis Ngannou. Then more recently, a couple days ago, you had One Championship come out and say, look, we're not submitting a final offer to Francis Ngannou because we weren't aligned on non-financial terms. And that's a very key wording from One Championship. And then the next day they say, oh, we wish Francis Ngannou well. He's a great champion. I'm sure he'll sign somewhere. The next day, Chatri, the CEO of One Championship, comes out and says that Francis Ngannou, we offered him $20 million, but he wanted to dictate, his opponent's pay, and he wanted a seat on the board of directors. And I'm not going to sit here and say that that is false, but Chatri does have a checkered past and a checkered record in regards to his organization. He lies about numbers all the time. We've got financials from One Championship that have completely basically been the opposite of what Chatri has said. They buy views on YouTube. He's not a legitimate source, and I would take that with a grain of salt. But even if that is true, people saying Francis Ngannou made a massive mistake by leaving the UFC. Well, according to One Championship, they're offering him $20 million. Now, again, I'm not saying that's true. I think the One Championship CEO is just trying to get headlines, trying to make his organization in the headlines, trying to stay relevant. And I also believe it's a PR move. Like, look, we offered Francis Ngannou $20 million. We're paying our fighters great. I don't necessarily believe the $20 million number, and I don't necessarily believe him saying that Francis Ngannou wanted to be on the board of directors. He can't be trusted at all. Maybe it is true, but I'm just saying take it with a grain of salt. And now people are wondering, well, what's going to happen? There's really only Bellator, and then there's PFL left, and then there's the potential boxing option, which Francis Ngannou has talked about quite a bit. And, you know, it's looking like there's only a few limited players left, and maybe Francis Ngannou did make a mistake. And people keep going back to, you had the UFC essentially offer Francis Ngannou $8 million for a Jon Jones fight. That is the figure that has been floated out there. I think Francis Ngannou has ever even said it himself for the Jon Jones fight. And people keep saying, well, he made a massive mistake. He would have took that $8 million, maybe some pay-per-view points on top of that. He made a huge mistake. Well, recently, there's somebody tweeted at Eric Nixick, which is Francis Ngannou's coach, and said, from who? Dana offered him $8 million per fight for 3 fights. He won't sniff that again. And I don't remember what the initial tweet was, but Eric Nixick tweeted back and said it wasn't $8 million per fight. Had he lost to Jon Jones, his pay would have significantly dropped. That was one of the hangups in re-signing. He had no protection if he lost to arguably the MMA GOAT. I think there's a lot of misinformation being tossed around. And that's news right there. That's news right there. Because essentially probably what Ngannou's contract was $8 million to fight Jon Jones. Maybe they weren't giving him pay-per-view. Maybe they were giving him very low pay-per-view points. But it was going to drop significantly if he lost to Jon Jones. Which I know people are going to say, well, he should be confident in himself. That doesn't matter, you know what I mean? The pay structure the UFC offers, the show and win, and I'm not talking about that in relation to Francis Ngannou, is not a fair structure itself. I'm not saying it's the worst thing ever, but there's a big difference between $8 million a fight and $8 million for one fight. There is a massive difference in that. And people just keep saying because of this, because he turned this down, they essentially, you know, he fumbled the bag. People keep regurgitating over and over again, meaning he made a massive mistake. He lost a lot of money. And now people are wondering, okay, so what's going to happen? Essentially, you have Bellator, you have PFL, and you have the boxing route. It doesn't look like the Bellator option is going to happen. Scott Coker's kind of been weird about that, talking about that. Then there's the speculation PFL is buying Bellator. There's been no legitimate sources reporting that, but that's just kind of been a rumor out there. And now most people are kind of set. Okay, it looks like Francis Ngannou is going to sign to PFL. And I believe if Francis Ngannou does sign anywhere, whether it be Bellator, whether it be PFL, and he gets a big deal, I believe there will be a huge narrative change. Right now, the narrative from the UFC shills, from the WME zombies, is Francis Ngannou made a mistake, Francis Ngannou got greedy, and basically Francis Ngannou's not going to get paid from anyone. Nobody cares about Francis Ngannou. Francis Ngannou is irrelevant. If he signs a new deal, whether it be with PFL or Bellator or any other organization that maybe I'm not thinking of, the narrative will immediately change from Francis Ngannou made a massive mistake to now whatever promotion, insert the name of the promotion, we'll say PFL. PFL made a massive mistake signing Ngannou and they're overpaying him. That will be the new narrative change. And even if Ngannou does sign with PFL, and let's say he makes the same as the UFC was offering, or let's say he even makes a little bit less, with PFL, he has the opportunity to get sponsors, which can make up for millions of dollars. And that's not only in the cage. The UFC did not let fighters have sponsors the week of the fight at all. So Francis Ngannou, even if he is to make less from PFL, and just a little bit less from PFL, maybe a couple million, which isn't a little bit, but you get my point. He can make that up with sponsors. And that's not even necessarily the truth right now. We're just pure speculation here. I believe that Francis Ngannou will sign with PFL. I believe that's what's going to happen. I'm going to talk about a few opponents here in a second. I believe he will sign with PFL, and I believe his contract will be a very big contract. I don't know what the numbers are going to be. I think it's going to be somewhere close to what the UFC was offering, if not more. And then you factor in that sponsorship. It's hard to say it's a mistake at this point. And again, that's pure speculation. But the one thing I really want to hammer home is I guarantee, mark my words, comment down below right now, I guarantee the narrative will shift. If Ngannou gets a massive fight deal from PFL, they will say PFL overpaid him. PFL made a mistake now. That will be the new narrative, because what you have here is you have a large capacity of the fan base who just gobble up anything the UFC says, gobble up anything Dana White says, and they're basically angry that Francis Ngannou left. I'm angry Francis Ngannou left. I understand why, because I'm not a super emotional person when it comes to people I've never met in life and don't know I exist. But I wanted to see Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones. That was a dream fight of mine. And I am very, very sad that he left, but I understand why he left. But a lot of fans can't rationalize that in their brains, and they say Francis Ngannou was greedy. Francis Ngannou made a mistake. He couldn't possibly have challenged the UFC and potentially made a better decision and make more money outside the UFC, which remains to be seen. But I'm just saying that's why so many fans are angry, because they just like to regurgitate Dana White. They like to regurgitate anything. They're always pro UFC no matter what. And that's why a lot of fans have turned on Francis Ngannou, because they're sad that the UFC was unwilling or unable to re-sign Francis Ngannou. And now we're not getting that Jon Jones fight. And so now everyone is saying Francis Ngannou is irrelevant. And what I find funny about that narrative, Francis Ngannou is irrelevant. Francis Ngannou has been a massive topic of conversation essentially for 3 months now. And those same people who are talking about him on a daily basis, tweeting about him, making videos about him, writing articles about him, they're the same people saying he's fading into obscurity. No one's going to care about Francis Ngannou. They're talking about him on a daily basis. And then you have the discussion, well, if Francis Ngannou signs with PFL, they're not going to sell any pay-per-views. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. There's one thing that I've heard regurgitated so many times, I've talked about this a couple times on videos, is that Francis Ngannou versus Cyril Gane sold 200,000 pay-per-view buys. There is no legitimate source that has ever reported that. That is a made-up figure that has been regurgitated around the MMA community. There is no evidence to support that claim whatsoever. And that's not to say that Francis Ngannou is going to go to PFL and be some massive pay-per-view star, but Francis Ngannou is a very promotable fighter. He looks like a freak athlete. He's massive. He's ripped. And what does he do almost every single fight? He knocks his opponent out brutally, stiffens them. There has not been a more promotable heavyweight champion, in my opinion, in UFC history, other than Brock Lesnar, just based off his WWE name value. Brock Lesnar, in terms of skill set and in terms of the way he fought, was nowhere near as promotable as Francis Ngannou. The only reason he had the star power that he had was because of his fan transfer from the WWE, following him over to the UFC. It made him a massive star. Francis Ngannou is a popular fighter. People care about Francis Ngannou. People will follow him to another organization, or if he decides to go box, which we're going to talk about in a second. I'm not saying that Francis Ngannou is going to sell 1 million pay-per-view buys over at PFL. But even if he brings PFL 300,000 pay-per-view buys or even 200,000 pay-per-view buys, PFL's goal is not to sign Francis and all of a sudden sell 1 million pay-per-view buys. That's not what they're thinking here. PFL is trying to build a long-term company. They're trying to get eyes on their organization. And if they sign Francis Ngannou, even if they take a loss because they pay him so much money that they're not able to sell a bunch of pay-per-views and recoup that money, guess what? They're trying to build their organization. UFC was losing money early. When UFC first started, UFC was losing money early. But they continued to push and continued to build their organization, and look at where they are today. And again, I'm not saying that Francis is going to be some massive pay-per-view star, but I believe people will tune in for his fight. Now, who could he potentially fight at PFL? I think there's a couple names, but one name that really popped into my mind was, I believe the PFL, I almost said the UFC, PFL could do Francis Ngannou versus Fabricio Werdum. Fabricio Werdum was signed with the PFL. He left the PFL. He's released for some reason or what. I don't remember exactly what happened. But all of a sudden, Fabricio Werdum is back on the juice. He's posting pictures of himself. He's jacked as hell. Fabricio Werdum is a former UFC champion. He left the UFC. He wasn't completely washed at that point. And I'm not saying I would love this fight. I want Francis Ngannou in the UFC if it's up to me. I think they could do Francis Ngannou, Fabricio Werdum as a headliner of a pay-per-view. And I think it would do okay. I think it would do okay. I think a lot of fans would tune in. The same people saying he's irrelevant, the same people saying it doesn't matter that Francis Ngannou is now fighting outside the UFC. I'm not going to watch him. I think it would do all right. And even if you have a Francis Ngannou that goes out there and fights like a Bruno Capoloza or an Ante D'Elia, I still think people are going to tune in. And if Francis Ngannou is even making even money from PFL as he would have made in the UFC, it is the best decision of his life. Because guess what? He's not going to take any damage. And I'm not saying the UFC heavyweight division is the most stacked division. Maybe we'll talk about that in a second. But Francis Ngannou in the UFC, he's going to be fighting John Jones. He's going to be fighting a Sergey Pavlovich. He's going to be fighting a Cyril Gane. He's going to take some damage. And even though I believe the PFL heavyweight division, if they re-sign Fabricio and you look at Bruno Capoloza and Ante D'Elia, I'm not saying they're the worst fighters ever, but I think Francis Ngannou is a lot more likely to steamroll them than he is like a guy like Sergey Pavlovich. We saw how a fight with Francis Ngannou and Cyril Gane went. Francis Ngannou reverted to his wrestling to win that fight. So if he makes the same amount of money and now he's taking zero damage over at PFL, it's the best decision that he ever made, and I believe he will make more money. Now, also, we had Francis Ngannou talk about boxing for the longest time. Talk about, I want to go box Tyson Fury. I want to go box Anthony Joshua. I want to go box Deontay Wilder. It doesn't look like that's going to happen. I never thought it was going to happen from the second he left. I'm like, I don't want to see this. I don't think it's going to happen. I think, these people are kind of toying with this idea as a potential way to just kind of promote a little bit and get their name out there in the headlines. Oh, the UFC heavyweight champion wants to fight me. I do think there's a small possibility, and maybe PFL gives him an option in his contract to go box. But I think if Francis Ngannou's not able to box a Tyson Fury or a Deontay Wilder or Anthony Joshua, even if he made a bit more getting those boxing matches, I think that is even a better decision in his career. Because if he goes right now and boxes Tyson Fury, and I'm not a big boxing fan, I don't watch a lot of boxing. I've seen Francis Ngannou striking, I've seen Tyson Fury striking. If Francis Ngannou goes right now and boxes Tyson Fury, maybe he'll make $20 million. Maybe he will. But guess what? He's going to get destroyed immediately. And, then he's actually going to be hugely devalued. He's going to be hugely devalued. Now, if he has a decent showing, okay, that's not the same. But I believe taking Francis Ngannou, who, he doesn't have technical striking at all. He's a knockout artist. He swings wildly. He finds people's chin. And he's successful in the heavyweight division. He's fun to watch. You put him against a pure boxer, he's going to get boxed up. He's going to take a lot of damage. I don't know how his stamina is going to last with all those rounds, and it's going to devalue him significantly on the MMA market. I think the best case scenario for Francis, he gets a big contract with PFL for 4 or 5 fights for $10 million a fight or whatever it may be, beats up not the greatest level of competition, and then guess what? He retires with a bunch of cash, and he took very limited damage. And I know a lot of people are going to say, oh, there's really no one for him to fight over there. I mentioned some of the names, but I do want to say this. The UFC heavyweight division isn't the elite of the elite. I mean, don't get me wrong, the top portion of the UFC heavyweight division is very good. But stop acting like we got a bantamweight heavyweight division, okay? The UFC division after the top 5 completely falls off a cliff. You have John Jones, who just said today he's probably going to retire after beating up the dead corpse of Stipe Miocic. You have Cyril Gane, who can't wrestle to save his life. But again, Cyril Gane, very good fighter. John Jones, very good fighter. Then you have Sergey Pavlovich, which, I'm so sad we're not getting a Francis Ngannou Sergey Pavlovich fight. That's so unfortunate. Then you have Stipe Miocic, who's going to be retiring soon. You have Curtis Blades, Francis Ngannou already beat up twice. And then you have Tom Aspinall. And then the division falls off a literal cliff. Tai Tuivasa, I know he has knockout power, but not very skilled outside of that. Alexander Volkov, Sergey Spivak, Jairzinho Rozenstruik, Marcin Tybura. Outside of the top 10, it falls off a cliff. And 2 of those top 5 are going to be retiring soon. So we have to stop acting like the UFC heavyweight division is some stacked division that is just full of talent as far as the eye can see, because it's not. Francis Ngannou versus John Jones would have been massive. That's my #1 fight I wanted to see for the last 2 years. I am saddened deeply that Francis Ngannou is not with the UFC, but I understand why. And people keep saying regarding the money, Francis Ngannou is greedy. We've seen it time and time again. It's not about the money anyway. He's getting basically offers of substantial amounts of money from the UFC, from apparently one championship, if you want to take them at their word, and there's no doubt PFL as well. And he's asking for terms that are non-financial terms. He's asking for things, like one of the rumor things he's asking for is for his opponents not to make under a certain amount. There was talk from the UFC about potential health insurance for different fighters. There was talk, he wanted in his UFC contract, he wanted to be able to have different sponsors on his shirts and shorts and stuff like that. So we have to stop acting like the end-all, be-all for Francis Ngannou is money. It is not. He's shown time and time again, and I understand that, you know, not everyone's a reliable source. I've even talked about the one CEO not being a reliable source. Dana White's not a reliable source. It's not like I'm sitting here trusting every word that Francis Ngannou is saying. If there's one thing that everyone involved in this situation has agreed on and has verbally said out loud, is it's not about money for Francis Ngannou. And there's some people that just can't stand that. They see that, oh, wait a second, Francis Ngannou's turning down $8 million? I'll never see $8 million in my life. Why is he turning this down? He's greedy. He must be greedy. He's looking for non-financial terms as well as a big paycheck. That is what he's looking for. That is what he cares about. So even if Francis Ngannou never fights again, he's already made it. He's not going to work another day in his life, you know, in terms of actual real hard work. He used to work in the sand mines. He was dirt poor. He has an amazing story to promote as well. And if he never fights again, I'm sure he has enough money. He will be perfectly fine. Now, if we find out Francis Ngannou in a year or two is dead broke, he's out there panhandling on the side of the road, we can say, okay, Francis Ngannou made a mistake. There were some clear career choices that he made that he should not have made. But right now, we just have such a limited set of information that it's impossible to truly know, which I talked about in the beginning of the video. But I believe no matter where Francis Ngannou ends up next, he will get a very big deal. He will make a decent amount of money. And I believe that people will immediately turn on that promoter who paid Francis Ngannou, because they've turned on Francis Ngannou because he refused to re-sign with the UFC, and people are just angry about that, and they cannot let that go. But what I want to end this video on, Francis Ngannou does not care about money. He does not care about money. Of course, to some extent he does, but I'm just saying that's not the main motivating factor for Francis Ngannou. It's not that $50 million paycheck. And I also believe Francis Ngannou never boxing may be the best thing that ever happened to him, or he better fight a couple MMA fights and then as his last career move, have a big boxing match against one of these guys that he wants to box, you know, Tyson Fury or Anthony Joshua or Deontay Wilder, which is kind of intriguing, but I still think he would get destroyed. I think that's the way to go, because he's going to get absolutely washed by one of these boxers. I think ultimately, if he signs with PFL, he makes the same amount of money the UFC is offering him. It is a massive win, and it was the best decision of his life. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and thank you so much for watching.